The storm broke over Redemption Gulch with the fury of a betrayed god. Rain thick and cold as coffin nails hammered the muddy street, turning it into a churning river of filth and forgotten hope. Lightning tore across the black sky, each flash illuminating a town hunched in on itself, its false-fronted buildings looking like skeletal faces in the strobing light. Inside the sheriff's office, James Morrison watched the deluge, a tight, cruel smile playing on his lips. The thunder was a perfect accomplice, swallowing the sounds of his work. He turned from the window, his shadow looming large and distorted in the lamplight. 3 men stood waiting, their faces a mixture of greed and unease. Deputy Frank Miller, a brute with fists like cured hams. Peters, young and twitchy, always looking for approval. And a hulking man named Silas, whose loyalty was bought and paid for with Morrison's silver. "It's time," Morrison said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the storm's roar. "The street's empty. No one will see a thing." They moved out into the downpour, their slickers plastered to their bodies. They didn't head for the saloon or the general store. They marched directly to the Redemption Bank and trussed a squat brick building that held the town's meager wealth. There was no finesse, no quiet lockpicking. Silas slammed a crowbar into the gap between the door and its frame, and with a splintering crack of tortured wood, they were inside. The bank teller, a balding, terrified man named Elias Cobb, was working late. He looked up from his ledger, his eyes wide with panic, as the 4 armed men dripped rainwater onto his polished floor. Sheriff Cobb stammered, "What's happening?" "Official business," Elias Morrison said smoothly, pulling off his gloves. He ignored the open vault, the stacks of currency, the canvas bags filled with coin. His gaze was fixed on the wall of brass-fronted safe deposit boxes. "I need you to open one for me." "But I can't do that without the key holder, Sheriff. It's bank policy." Miller stepped forward and slammed Cobb against the wall, and the impact knocking the breath from the smaller man's lungs. "The sheriff just made a new policy," Miller growled. Morrison walked to the wall and pointed a finger at a specific box number 17. "That one, Elias. And be quick about it." Shaking, Cobb fumbled with the master key, his hands slick with sweat. He inserted it, then turned to Morrison. "I need the owner's key, sir." Morrison produced a small, simple brass key from his pocket. It was old, worn smooth by years of handling. Cobb's eyes widened in recognition, but he said nothing, his fear a gag in his throat. He inserted the second key, turned it, and the small brass door clicked open. Morrison reached inside his fingers, brushing past what felt like a small, velvet-lined box. He ignored it. He was searching for something else. His fingers closed around a stack of papers tied with a faded ribbon and a small object, cold and metallic. He pulled them out. Under the flickering lamplight, he untied the ribbon. The documents were old, brittle with age. Land deed surveyor's reports and a sworn affidavit, signed by a man long dead. Morrison scanned them, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. He carefully folded them and tucked them deep inside his coat. Then he looked at the second item lying in his palm. It was a silver locket tarnished by time and neglect. A simple heart-shaped piece etched with the image of a single wildflower. It wasn't valuable. It was sentimental, a keepsake from a life that no longer existed. But as Morrison stared at it, his face contorted into a mask of pure, undiluted hatred. The triumph vanished, replaced by a loathing so profound it seemed to poison the air in the room. This small, worthless piece of silver was the ghost at his feast, the one loose thread in a tapestry of lies he had spent 15 years weaving. His fingers tightened. The metal groaned in protest. With a final violent clench of his fist, the locket buckled, its delicate hinge snapping. He crushed it, the soft silver deforming into a mangled, unrecognizable lump. He didn't drop it. He held the ruined metal in his hand, the sharp edges digging into his flesh, the pain a welcome anchor in a sea of bitter memory. "Burn the rest," he ordered, his voice thick with suppressed violence. He tossed the mangled locket back into the box. All of it. Make it look like a botched robbery. As Miller and Silas doused the box's contents with oil from a lamp, Elias Cobb stared at the sheriff, his mind reeling. They weren't robbing the bank. This was something else entirely. This was an exorcism, a violent attempt to murder a memory. As the flames erupted inside the small brass compartment, Morrison turned and walked out into the storm, and the rain washing over his face, but failing to extinguish the fire burning behind his eyes. 15 years of dust and distance couldn't erase the ghosts of Redemption Gulch. Boone Carter felt them in the wind that whispered through the skeletal remains of his old ranch in the silent accusation of the 2 weathered headstones on the hill. Sarah, Lily. The names were carved deep in the wood, and deeper still in his soul. He was a man defined by loss, hollowed out by a fire that had consumed his world one terrible night a decade and a half ago. The official report, signed by a young ambitious deputy named James Morrison, had called it an accident. A stray lantern in the barn. A tragic, unavoidable act of fate. Boone had tried to believe it had wandered the territories for years, trying to outrun the smoke-filled memories. But the truth was a splinter in his heart he could never quite pull free. Now he was back for one final painful act of severance. He had returned to sell the last parcel of his land, the scorched earth where his home once stood. It was time to cut the final tie to take the money and ride until the name Redemption Gulch was just another forgotten whisper on the trail. He stood before the graves, his hat in his hands, the rough fabric twisted in his grip. "It's done, Sarah," he murmured to the silent earth. "Sold the land. There's nothing left for me here now." He placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on the packed dirt, the same kind etched on the silver locket he had given her, the one that was supposed to have been buried with her. The undertaker had said it must have melted in the inferno. Another detail that never sat right. His business in town was concluded at the land office, the deed signed over to a faceless corporation represented by a slick lawyer from back east. As he stepped out onto the boardwalk, the midday sun glinting off the tin star on Sheriff Morrison's chest caught his eye. The sheriff was leaning against a post, watching him with an unnerving stillness. The boyish deputy from 15 years ago had become a man hardened by authority, his eyes holding a cold, proprietary gleam as he surveyed the town that was effectively his kingdom. Carter Morrison said, his voice holding a note of false cordiality. "Heard you were back. Tying up loose ends, are we?" Something like that, Boone replied, his tone clipped. He had never trusted Morrison, not then and not now. There was a predator's patience about the man that set his teeth on edge. Good. A man shouldn't spend his life looking backward. Morrison's eyes flicked toward the hill where Boone's family was buried. Some things are best left in the past, buried and forgotten. The words were meant to sound like wisdom, but they felt like a taunt, a veiled warning. The air thickened between them, charged with the unspoken history of that long-ago fire. Before Boone could form a reply, the doors to the saloon swung open, and a frantic-looking ranch hand stumbled out. "Sheriff, it's the Whitmans. Their place. It's been burned to the ground." A murmur rippled through the street. The Whitmans, Jonathan, Sarah, and their 3 young children were good people, the salt of the earth. Jonathan Whitman, in particular, was a man of principle, respected by settlers and the local Apache alike for his fairness. "Apaches," Morrison said immediately, his voice ringing with grim certainty. "It's another raid. I've been warning you all this was coming." He pushed himself off the post, his movements suddenly filled with purpose. "Miller Peters, saddle up. We've got savages to hunt." Boone watched as the sheriff organized his posse, his gut twisting into a cold knot. It felt too clean, too rehearsed. Jonathan Whitman had no enemies among the Apache. He traded with them, spoke their language, and had publicly defended their land rights against the encroaching interests of men like Morrison and his cousin, a wealthy investor named Fletcher, who had been buying up vast tracts of the valley. An Apache raid, it didn't make any sense. Later that day, as Boone was packing his saddlebags for the last time, he heard the official news. The Whitman family had perished in the fire. No survivors. Another tragedy to lay at the feet of the savage Apache, another reason for Morrison to tighten his grip on the territory. But Boone couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Jonathan and Sarah had helped him in the dark days after he'd lost his own family, offering him food, shelter, and a quiet compassion that asked for nothing in return. He owed them more than just a sad shake of the head. He owed them the truth. Driven by a duty he couldn't name, he mounted his horse and rode out toward the Whitman homestead, not west toward the open plains and his new empty life, but east toward the plume of smoke still sullying the clear blue sky. The stench of wet charred wood and shattered lives hit him 100 yards out. The Whitman home was a blackened skeleton, its ribs open to the sky. Morrison's men had already been there and gone their search as cursory as their verdict. A few scattered arrows likely planted were the only evidence of the supposed raid. Boone dismounted his boots, crunching on scorched earth and broken glass. He walked through the ruins, the silence screaming louder than any sound. This was where the children's bedroom had been. That was the kitchen where Sarah Whitman had once given him a warm slice of apple pie and told him that life somehow would go on. He knelt near the spot where the root cellar door had been, now just a heap of smoldering timbers. Jonathan had been a meticulous man, a planner. If there was trouble, he would have gotten his family to that cellar. As Boone sifted through the debris, his fingers brushed against something solid beneath a loose floorboard near the foundation. He pried it up. Hidden in the small space beneath was a single sheet of paper miraculously untouched by the flames. It was creased and folded, but the writing was clear. It wasn't one of Jonathan's documents. It was a page from a land deed. Boone's blood ran cold as he read the familiar legal script. It was a deed transfer for his own original ranch, the one that had burned 15 years ago. It was dated 1 week after the fire. And it was signed over to a holding company owned by a man named Alistair Fletcher, Sheriff Morrison's cousin. His eyes scanned down to the bottom of the page to the signature of the official witness who had validated the transaction. The name was written in a confident, youthful script that he recognized instantly from the fire report he had stared at for countless nights. The James Morrison deputy. The world tilted on its axis. The paper shook in his hand. This wasn't just a clue. It was a bridge, a dark and terrible connection between two fiery tragedies 15 years apart. Jonathan Whitman hadn't just been a victim of a random raid. He had uncovered something. He had found proof of the real reason Boone's family had died. And for that knowledge, he and his own family had been silenced. Boone was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man chained to it, and the key was locked in the ashes of his friend's home. A faint trail led away from the back of the burned-out homestead, almost invisible to an untrained eye. A child's footprint, small and hurried, overlaid by the scuffed moccasin print of someone trying to cover their tracks. Boone followed it for miles, his senses honed by years of solitary travel. The trail led deep into the harsh, rocky terrain, ending at a dilapidated line cabin that had been abandoned for 3 winters ever since the Miller family succumbed to fever. But it wasn't abandoned now. A thin, nervous wisp of smoke curled from the stone chimney. The front porch had been swept clean of debris, and a broken shutter was mended with a crude but effective leather strap. Someone was here. He dismounted a good distance away, approaching on foot with the silence of a shadow. As he drew closer, he could see the cabin was barricaded from the inside. The windows were shuttered, the door reinforced with a heavy beam. This was not a welcome place. It was a fortress. He was about to call out when a voice clear and feminine cut through the stillness. "Stay where you are." The voice came from the trees to his left. An Apache woman emerged from the cover of the pines, a bow held loosely in her hand, an arrow nocked but not drawn. Her face was etched with exhaustion and fierce resolve. Boone recognized the leather strips braided into her long black hair. They were from a settler's garments, worn not as trophies, but as mourning bands. "I mean you no harm," Boone said, keeping his hands open and away from his gun. "That's what the last white man said," she replied, her dark eyes sizing him up, judging him, "just before he tried to set this cabin on fire with us inside." The pieces fell into place. The children. They were here. The Whitman children. Boone stated not a question. Her eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" "My name is Boone Carter. I was a friend of Jonathan Whitman." The woman's posture relaxed slightly, but the suspicion remained. "Words are easy. Morrison's men are scouring these hills. For all I know, you're one of them." Boone saw the raw, protective instinct in her, the cornered desperation of a mother bear. He knew forcing his way in would only end in violence. He had to earn her trust. "I'm not one of them," he said quietly. "I found this at the homestead." He carefully pulled the folded deed page from his pocket and held it out. "I think Jonathan was killed because of what he knew about my family's death 15 years ago." She stared at him, and then at the paper, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she said nothing. The only sound was the wind sighing through the pines. Boone didn't move. He stood his ground, letting the silence do the work. "Why should I trust you?" she finally asked. "Because right now, I'm the only man in this valley who wants Sheriff Morrison gone as much as you do." He slowly unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the ground. He unstrapped the canteen from his saddle and the bag of jerky he'd packed. He placed them on a large, flat rock between them. "They'll need water. And food. I'll leave these here. I'll come back at dawn. You have until then to decide." He turned and walked back to his horse without looking back, every nerve ending screaming at him to stay to protect them. But he knew this was the only way. Trust couldn't be demanded. It had to be given. He spent a cold, sleepless night, camped in a ravine a mile away, the deed page lying open on his lap. He stared at Morrison's signature until it burned itself into his memory. He wasn't just fighting for the Whitmans anymore. He was fighting for Sarah and Lily. Just before dawn, a low-pained cry echoed from the direction of the cabin. It was a child's cry, weak and feverish. Boone didn't hesitate. He mounted his horse and rode hard, a cold dread seizing his heart. He found the woman kneeling on the cabin porch, cradling the youngest child, a small boy, in her arms. The boy was shivering violently, his face flushed with fever. "He's sick," she said, her voice stripped of its earlier defiance, now filled with raw fear. "He fell in the creek 2 days ago. I thought it was just a chill, but it's getting worse." Boone swung down from his horse and knelt beside her. He gently touched the boy's forehead. He was burning up. "His name is Samuel," she whispered. "He needs medicine. A doctor." "The town doctor is in Morrison's pocket," Boone said grimly, "but I have some quinine in my saddlebags. It might help." the woman Ayanna finally looked at him, her defenses shattered by a mother's fear for a child not her own. In her eyes, he saw a flicker of hope, a desperate willingness to trust. "Please," she said the single word, a surrender and a plea. He worked quickly, mixing the bitter powder with water from his canteen. He showed Ayanna how to administer it, how to cool the boy's fevered skin with a damp cloth. Inside the cabin, the other two children, a boy of about 8 and a girl a few years younger, watched him with wide, wary eyes. The older boy, Tommy, stood protectively in front of his sister, his small face a mask of old man gravity. "She saved us," Tommy said suddenly, his voice clear and steady. "Her name is Ayanna. The bad men came and she hid us." "I know," Boone said gently. "She's very brave." For the next several hours, he and Ayanna worked together, tending to Samuel. They spoke little, but a bond was forming in the shared, silent task of saving a child's life. As the sun rose higher, Samuel's fever began to break. His shivering subsided, and he fell into a deep, healing sleep. Ayanna slumped against the wall, the tension draining out of her in a rush. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We're not out of this yet." Boone said, his gaze turning to the rugged landscape outside. "Morrison's men will be back. They won't stop until they find you. We can't stay here." Tommy stepped forward. "Where will we go?" he asked, the wary bravery in his eyes, warring with a child's fear. Boone looked at the 3 orphans and the Apache woman who had become their protector. They were a broken makeshift family, hunted and alone. But they were all he had left to fight for. "We're going to Fort Randall," he said, the plan forming as he spoke. "We're going to find a man named Colonel Hayes, and we are going to tell him everything." Their journey began under the cold light of a crescent moon, a desperate exodus across a land that had become a hunting ground. Boone led the way, his horse carrying little Samuel, who was wrapped in blankets and nestled securely in front of him. Ayanna followed on foot, her steps as silent as a falling leaf, with 8-year-old Tommy and 6-year-old Lily holding tightly to her hands. They moved through the shadows, avoiding the main trails, sticking to the ravines and wooded ridges where Morrison's patrols were less likely to venture. The landscape was an adversary in itself. The sun beat down on the cracked earth by day, mirroring the fractured hope in Boone's heart. By night, the temperature plummeted, and the wind howled through the canyons like a hungry wolf. Every snapped twig, every dislodged stone was a potential death sentence. Boone pushed them onward, his senses on high alert, the weight of their survival pressing down on him. After 2 days of grueling travel, they found temporary refuge at a small, isolated ranch owned by the Henderson brothers. Jake and Moses Henderson were honest, hard-working men who had known Boone for years and trusted his word implicitly. When Boone explained the situation, their faces hardened with grim understanding. "Morrison's been leaning on folks for months," Jake said, his voice low and angry, "scaring them into selling cheap to that cousin of his. We just never imagined he'd go this far." Moses, the quieter of the two, looked at the exhausted faces of the children. "They can stay here as long as they need. Our home is their home." For a few days, the cabin felt like a sanctuary. The children ate hot meals, slept in real beds, and for the first time in weeks, the constant fear in their eyes began to recede. During this brief respite, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Boone asked Tommy to recount every detail of the attack he could remember. The boy's memory was chillingly precise. "They weren't just looking for papers," Tommy said, his small voice steady. "Sheriff Morrison kept yelling at my pa, asking where the old box was. He said my pa was a traitor for digging up bones." Digging up bones. The phrase sent a shiver down Boone's spine. Jonathan Whitman hadn't just stumbled upon the fraudulent deed for Boone's old ranch. He must have been actively investigating, digging into the past. Ayanna listened intently, her expression growing darker. When Tommy finished, she spoke. "My people have a long memory, Boone Carter," she said, her voice imbued with a quiet power. "We remember when Deputy Morrison first came to this valley. He spoke of progress of clearing the land for new settlers. But his progress was a plague. He led the charge that drove my tribe from our ancestral hunting grounds, the very land your ranch was built on. He burned our winter stores, claimed our sacred sites were pagan, and called it the law." Her eyes held the weight of a generation of loss. "My own family was forced out. My father died on the long walk to the reservation. This fight with Morrison, it is my fight too." Her words solidified the bond between them. This was no longer just Boone's quest for vengeance or his duty to the Whitmans. It was a shared battle against a common evil. Ayanna was not a passive victim he was protecting. She was a warrior, a survivor, with a stake in this fight as deep and personal as his own. Their fragile peace was shattered 3 days later. Moses Henderson rode in from town, his face pale with alarm. "It's Morrison," he said, swinging down from his horse. "He knows you're here. He sent Miller to our place this morning. Didn't threaten us directly. Just said it was a shame about the string of bad luck ranchers we're having. This afternoon we found 20 head of our cattle missing. Poisoned waterhole down the creek. Morrison's influence was like a cancer spreading through the valley. He was closing his net, pressuring their allies, turning the entire territory against them. They had to leave." That night, as Ayanna was mending a tear in Lily's dress, Boone sat by the lamplight, staring again at the deed page he'd found in the ashes. He traced the lines of the text, the legal jargon that had stolen his past. His eyes landed once more on the witness signature. James Morrison, Deputy. The clear, confident script of a young man on the rise, a man building his future on the graves of others. Tommy, unable to sleep, came to sit beside him. He pointed a small finger at the paper. "That's like the papers my pa found," he whispered. "They were in an old box. Mama's box." He paused, his brow furrowed in thought. There was something else in there too. Something shiny. When the sheriff found it, he got real angry. It looked like a silver heart. Boone's breath caught in his throat. His blood turned to ice. A silver heart, Tommy, what did it look like? "It had a flower on it," the boy said, his voice small. "A little one?" He squeezed it. He broke it. The world fell away. The cabin, the flickering lamp, and the sleeping children, it all vanished, replaced by a single searing image from a lifetime ago. Sarah, his Sarah, her face illuminated by sunshine, as he fastened a simple silver locket around her neck. A locket etched with a single wildflower, a perfect match for the one he had just laid on her grave. The truth hit him not as a thought, but as a physical blow, a gunshot to the soul that tore through 15 years of grief and denial. It wasn't an accident. Morrison hadn't just been an ambitious deputy who signed off on a questionable report. He had been there. He had set the fire. He had murdered Sarah and Lily to get his hands on their land, the prime parcel that Fletcher needed to begin his empire. And Jonathan Whitman, in his quiet, meticulous search for justice for his friend, had found the proof, the fraudulent deed, and the locket, a piece of evidence Morrison had missed, a token Sarah must have hidden in that box for safekeeping. Morrison hadn't just killed the Whitmans to cover up a land scheme. He had killed them to bury the truth of his first, most monstrous crime. Boone stood up the deed page, crumpling in his fist. The solitary wanderer was gone, burned away in the fire of this revelation. The man who stood in his place was no longer seeking justice. He was seeking vengeance. The fight wasn't for his friends anymore. It was for his family. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that this would not end at Fort Randall. It would end in Redemption Gulch with either his own blood or Morrison's soaking the dust of the town's main street. The revelation consumed Boone, transforming his grief into a cold, focused rage. The journey to Fort Randall was no longer a flight to safety. It was a strategic retreat, a means to gather strength before returning to settle a 15-year-old debt. But Morrison, sensing the shift in the wind, was growing more desperate, more dangerous. He could not allow Boone and the children to reach the fort. News traveled on the wind, carried by sympathetic ranchers and gossiping merchants. Boone learned that Morrison, unable to locate them in the sprawling wilderness, had devised a crueler, more calculated trap. He rode into Redemption Gulch and publicly arrested Jake Henderson. The charge was absurd, cattle rustling the very cattle Morrison's own men had stolen and killed. The announcement was swift and brutal. Jake Henderson would be tried, convicted, and hanged in 2 days' time, a public example of the price of aiding fugitives. The news reached their small camp like a physical blow. Moses, who had ridden out to meet a contact, returned with a devastating report, his face a mask of anguish and fury. "It's a trap, Boone," Moses said, his voice ragged. "He's daring you to come back. He knows you won't let an innocent man hang for you." Boone was caught in a devil's bargain. His every instinct screamed to protect the children, to continue the arduous journey to Fort Randall, and ensure their testimony would be heard. That was the logical path, the one that guaranteed justice in the end. But the image of Jake Henderson, a good man who had offered them sanctuary, standing on a gallows with a noose around his neck, was unbearable. To save Jake meant walking directly into Morrison's stronghold, facing him on his own terms, with his own men surrounding him. He was torn, the cold fire of his vengeance, warring with the profound responsibility he felt for the children and Ayanna. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood and fire, he stood apart from the camp, wrestling with the impossible choice. Ayanna came to him, her presence a quiet comfort in the turmoil of his thoughts. She stood beside him, watching the fading light. "You blame yourself for what has happened to Jake Henderson," she said, her voice soft but certain. "He helped us. Now he's going to die for it." The words were gravel in his throat. "Morrison is the one who arrested him. Morrison is the one who will kill him. His evil is his own. It does not belong to you. But if I ride into that town, I'm risking all of you." Boone countered, his voice raw. "Tommy, Lily, Samuel. Their safety comes first. I promise to protect them. And what lesson do we teach them if we leave a good man to die?" Anna's gaze was unwavering. "Do we teach them that justice is only for ourselves? That we sacrifice our friends to save our own skin? That is Morrison's way. It cannot be ours." She reached out and gently touched his arm, her touch grounding him. "We came together to fight an injustice, Boone. The injustice against the Whitmans, against your family, against my people. The injustice against Jake Henderson is part of the same fight. We cannot choose which parts of it we are willing to face." Her words cut through his conflict, illuminating the path with stark clarity. She was right. Running to Fort Randall while Jake swung from a rope was not a victory. It was a different kind of defeat. They could not sacrifice one life to save others. They had to stand together, or they would all fall apart. "We face him together," she said, as if reading his mind. "You are not alone in this." He looked at her then, at the strength and wisdom in her eyes, and knew she was his partner in this, an equal forged in the crucible of their shared struggle. The decision was made. They would not run. They would turn back. They would ride into the heart of the storm. "He'll be expecting me to come in guns blazing," Boone said, his mind already shifting from escape to attack. "A direct assault. But he won't be expecting all of us." They would not ride to Fort Randall. They would ride to Redemption Gulch. And they would bring the reckoning Morrison had earned 15 years ago. A malevolent wind swept down from the mountains, carrying with it a tide of red dust that choked the air and scoured the very soul of Redemption Gulch. The sky turned a bruised, sickly yellow. Doors slammed shut, windows were bolted, and the town hunkered down, surrendering its streets to the brewing storm. It was the perfect cover. Boone, Ayanna, Moses, and the children watched from a ridge overlooking the town. Down below, the hastily constructed gallows stood stark and ugly in the center of the street, a monument to Morrison's tyranny. The jail, a squat stone building with barred windows, was their target. Morrison will have men everywhere. Moses set his knuckles white as he gripped his rifle. The saloon, the hotel rooftops. "He'll be expecting me to come for the gallows," Boone replied, his eyes scanning the layout of the town. "But Jake's still in that cell. We get him out first. Create chaos. Use the storm." The plan was desperate, bordering on suicidal. Ayanna would take the children to the back of the livery stable, a place she knew had a hidden cellar where they could wait safely. Moses would create a diversion at the far end of town, setting a small controlled fire in an abandoned shed to draw some of Morrison's men away from the jail. That would be Boone's window. As darkness fell, the dust storm hit with full force. Visibility dropped to near zero. The world became a maelstrom of screaming wind and stinging grit. It was their signal. Ayanna led the children through the blinding dust, her movements swift and sure. Tommy held tightly to Lily, his face set with a grim determination that belied his age. Moses galloped to the edge of town, and moments later, an orange glow blossomed in the gloom. Shouts of fire cut through the howl of the wind. As expected, 3 of the deputies guarding the jail cursed and ran toward the blaze. Boone moved. He slipped through the storm like a phantom, the red dust his cloak. He reached the side of the jail, pressing himself flat against the cold stone. Only one deputy remained out front, Frank Miller. Inside, he could hear the low murmur of Morrison's voice. He crept to the front, his pistol drawn. Through the swirling dust, he saw Miller peering nervously into the storm, his hand on his gun. Boone was about to make his move when Ayanna appeared silently at his side. She had hidden the children and returned. "Wait," she whispered, her eyes fixed on Miller. "I know him. Or I knew his family. The Millers. Fletcher and Morrison stole their farm years ago before Frank took the badge. His father died a broken man. An idea, impossibly risky, sparked in Boone's mind. Ayanna understood immediately. She stepped out from the shadows, unarmed, her hands held open. "Frank Miller," she called out, her voice clear and strong against the wind. Miller spun around, startled, his gun half drawn. "Who's there?" "My name is Ayanna. I remember your father, Samuel Miller. He was an honest man. He used to trade with my people. He spoke of how this land was stolen from him." "Shut up," Miller snarled, but there was a tremor of uncertainty in his voice. The dust swirled, and for a moment he looked like a lost boy. "Morrison offers you silver to forget your father's ghost." Ayanna continued, her voice, not accusatory, but filled with a strange, sad empathy. "But does it buy you peace? Is the star on your chest worth the honor of your family's name?" Inside the jail, the door creaked open. Morrison stepped out, his face a mask of fury. "Miller, what in the hell is going on out here?" It was the critical moment. Miller was frozen between two worlds, his past and his present honor and fear. His eyes met Ayanna's, and in them she saw the flicker of a soul at war with itself. Boone didn't wait. He exploded from the shadows, his shoulders slamming into Morrison, sending both men crashing to the ground. Morrison's gun flew from his holster, skittering across the boardwalk. At that exact moment, Frank Miller made his choice. As the other deputy inside rushed out, Miller turned not on Boone, but on his fellow lawman, his pistol butt cracking across the man's jaw and sending him sprawling. "Go," Miller yelled at Boone. "Get him out." The fight was a brutal, swirling melee in the red dust. Boone and Morrison traded blows, a raw, desperate struggle 15 years in the making. Moses arrived, his rifle blazing, providing covering fire, as Boone dragged a stunned Jake Henderson from his cell. "This way," Moses shouted, leading them toward the back alley. A gunshot echoed sharp and final. Boone looked back. Morrison had recovered his gun and fired, but not at them. He had shot Frank Miller in the back. The deputy crumpled to the ground as Morrison, clutching a wounded arm, staggered back into the sheriff's office, barricading the door. Boone got Jake to safety with Moses, ordering them to get to the livery and protect the children. "This is between him and me now," Boone said, his voice deadly calm. He walked back through the storm-swept street to the sheriff's office. He kicked the door open. It splintered off its hinges. Morrison was inside, trying to reload his pistol, his arm bleeding heavily. He looked up, his face a mess of dirt, blood, and panicked hatred. "It's over, Morrison," Boone said, his own gun steady in his hand. "Never," Morrison spat. "You think you can just walk away from this?" "I'm not the one who needs to walk away," Boone said, his voice low and intense. He took a step closer. "This isn't about the Whitmans anymore, is it? This is about a fire 15 years ago. This is about a woman named Sarah and a little girl named Lily." Morrison's face went slack with shock. The color drained from his face. "How?" "Jonathan Whitman was a good man, and a better friend than you deserved. He found your secret. He found the deed you falsified. And he found her locket." Boone's voice cracked on the last word, the pain still raw, still immediate. "You didn't just kill them to cover up your land grab. You killed them because they knew you were a murderer long before you ever pinned on that star." Cornered and exposed, Morrison's composure finally shattered. "She wouldn't sell." He screamed, his voice a raw shriek of self-pity and rage. "That stubborn woman Fletcher needed the land. The whole valley started with that one piece of land. It was supposed to be simple, but she wouldn't sell the fire. The fire was supposed to scare you to make you leave. But it got out of control. The little girl. I didn't mean for the girl to." He trailed off, his confession hanging in the dusty air, a testament to a lifetime of greed that had rotted him from the inside out. He raised his gun, a final desperate act of defiance. Boone's pistol answered. The shot was not a sound of rage, but one of grim finality. Morrison crumpled to the floor, his reign of terror ending not with a bang, but with a defeated sigh in an office built on lies and paid for with blood. Boone stood over him, the gun smoking in his hand, the ghosts of 15 years, finally terribly silent. The dust storm abated as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air crisp and cold. As the first rays of dawn painted the bruised sky, a column of blue-coated cavalry rode into town. At their head was Colonel Hayes, his face grim. Beside him rode Moses Henderson, who had intercepted the patrol on the main road and guided them in. They found Boone sitting on the steps of the sheriff's office, his gun resting on his lap, his face a mask of profound exhaustion. The battle was over, but the war within him was only just beginning to settle. Colonel Hayes dismounted his eyes, taking in the scene, the body of Frank Miller being carried respectfully to the doctor's office, the bullet-riddled jail, and the captured deputies, their faces a mixture of fear and relief, being held under guard by Jake Henderson. Hayes's troops didn't save the day. They arrived to restore an order that Boone and his allies had already reclaimed. They took a wounded James Morrison into federal custody, along with his cousin Fletcher, who was found cowering in his hotel room. The box of evidence Boone had collected, the deed page Morrison's confession witnessed by Jake and the testimony of Ayanna and the children, ensured they would face a federal judge in a distant city, far from the reach of their blood money. In the days that followed, redemption. Gulch began to live up to its name. Led by the Henderson brothers, the townspeople organized. Armed with the proof of Fletcher's widespread fraud, they began the legal process of reclaiming the land that had been stolen from them. The fear that had held the valley in a chokehold for years finally broke, replaced by a fragile but determined sense of community and justice. The town was beginning to heal. A week later, under a clear, hopeful sky, Colonel Hayes and his wife stood on the porch of their spacious home at Fort Randall. Between them stood Tommy Lilly and Samuel, dressed in new, clean clothes. After hearing their story and seeing the profound bond they shared, the Hayeses, who had long been unable to have children of their own, made a formal offer. They would not just shelter the Whitman children. They would adopt them, giving them the safe, loving, and permanent home they so deeply deserved. Their future was finally secure. Boone and Ayanna watched from the bottom of the steps. In the crucible of their struggle, a powerful and unspoken bond had formed between them, forged in survival, mutual respect, and a shared purpose. Boone's plan to ride away, to disappear back into the wilderness, now felt like a hollow echo from another man's life. "The Hendersons have offered us a plot of land," Ayanna said quietly, her eyes on the children. "Not your old land. New ground, a place to build something new." Boone looked from the happy faces of the children to the strong, serene face of the woman beside him. He thought of his 15 years of lonely wandering, of running from ghosts that could never be outrun. Here, in this makeshift family born of tragedy, he had found something he thought was lost to him forever, a reason to stay. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the mangled piece of silver he had recovered from Morrison's office, the crushed remains of his wife's locket. He had carried it with him for days, a painful, tangible link to his loss. Their new beginning took place on a windswept hill, overlooking the valley, on the plot the grateful Henderson brothers had deeded to them. There was no house yet, only 4 cornerstones marking the foundation of a future they would build together. With Ayanna and the children beside him, Boone knelt and dug a small hole in the earth, directly where the hearth of their new home would one day stand. He held the crushed silver locket in his palm one last time, not with the agony of grief, but with the quiet acceptance of memory. This mangled piece of metal was not just a symbol of what he had lost, but a testament to the love that had set this entire journey in motion. He placed it gently in the earth. Ayanna took his hand, and together they pushed the soil back over it. Then Tommy, Lilly, and Samuel each placed a small stone on top their small hands, covering the spot. The act wasn't about erasing the past, but about integrating it, about building a new life upon the foundations of memory and loss. He was no longer running from his ghosts. He was planting a home above them, turning tragedy into a foundation for love, for family, and for a redemption he had never thought possible.